Good afternoon, everyone. I've come from Australia to give this talk, and delighted to be here. And it's about what you can learn from Corellas. And to start with, I'll be talking about, if it moves on.
Ian, could I
there we are.
request you
Okay,
to come closer to the mic?
Sorry. Yep.
Yeah, thanks.
There's been an introduction and quite a long context, a case study, Corellas at Berwick, and a conclusion. Now, Australia's been called the land of parrots. We've got 56 species of parrots, including 14 species of cockatoos, which tend to be much bigger than most of the parrots. 10 of these cockatoo species occur in Victoria. Several of those cockatoo species have behaviours that bring them into conflict with people, including feeding in a variety of grain, oilseed and other crops, nut crops. Many species are familiar with sulphur-crested cockatoos, or the white cocky as we commonly call it in Australia. And when somebody feeds birds and sulphur-crested cockatoos are attracted, they often then cause extensive damage to timber on houses or outdoor furniture. And that's directly a consequence of being attracted by food. Fewer people are aware of the smaller white cockatoos called Corellas. And there's two species there. In the foreground is a long-billed Corella, and behind it's a Little Corella. They're intelligent, noisy, flock-forming cockatoos common in many parts of Australia. The long-billed Corella, which I've studied in detail, and the Little Corella. The long-billed Corella was widespread and abundant when European colonists were exploring what is now Victoria in the early 1800s, but after the introduction of rabbits in the 1880s, it declined in numbers and distribution, and that's because the rabbits were feeding in grain left over in crop stubbles after the harvest in summer, when the ground was hard, and the Corellas, which normally dig up bulbs to eat, only had the crop grains, and this is because of other changes in their availability of foods because of the introduction of sheep earlier on. It's complicated. But the rabbits were in such big numbers that they were eating all the grain in stubbles. So young Corellas often didn't survive and the population declined massively. After the disease myxomatosis was introduced to control rabbit numbers in the early 1950s, the long-billed Corella population began to recover, and by the 1970s, farmers growing grain began to complain about damage to their crops. A parliamentary committee of inquiry investigated problems in Victoria caused by long-billed Corellas, sulphur-crested cockatoos and galahs, which are pink and grey cockatoos, in the 1990s, and I was its research officer. Oops. Hang on, there we are. Among its recommendations was that trapping and gassing of these species could be undertaken by farmers using government-owned traps that they would hire on a trial basis, combined with measures to estimate the reduction in crop damage through removal of birds. So it was a trial program to see if removing some birds by trapping them and killing them led to a reduction in damage. Against this, instead, well-connected farmers, wealthy farmers, lobbied the government, and they secured, or government provided public funds to employ teams to trap and gas long-billed Corellas, sulphur-crested cockatoos and galahs, and over 5 years more than $1 million was spent trapping and destroying 100,000 cockatoos with no knowledge of impacts on damage levels or on cockatoo populations. This reinforced the misconception that the answer to cockatoo damage, and by extension other wildlife damage, was to kill the culprits. Against this background, it's challenging to convince people to live with wildlife. Yet that was the thrust of a Corella strategy the government asked me to develop for Victoria in 2020. The Little Corella, it used to be a bird of inland waterways, but it's taken advantage of anthropogenic changes to the environment and spread towards the coast over recent decades, and is now familiar in many towns and cities where it can cause problems to infrastructure. Cockatoo beaks grow continuously, and they need to chew objects to maintain beak condition, but they also like to investigate objects in their environment, such as rubber seals on street lights or around windows. And these are Little Corellas on the dome of a shopping centre pulling out the rubber seals. And they'll manipulate anything they can manipulate with their beaks. A lot of it's play behaviour. They're just curious, they're bored, and they muck around with things. Many aspects of modern infrastructure are not Corella proof, as this destroyed tyre valve demonstrates. The birds were attracted there by open grain bunkers. Simple solution, enclose them, but the owner didn't want to do that. He was having enormous trouble with this sort of damage to pipes for irrigation systems, all sorts of things. So now we get to the case study. This is Australia, Victoria is in blue there at the bottom, and Berwick is the little red star here, just outlying suburb of Melbourne. There's a new housing estate there, and little Corellas moved in, and they chewed through solar water heating pipes on roofs, played in and pruned their roosting trees, leaving twigs and leaves littering the footpaths below, and their noise disturbed many residents. Complaints to the local council were fruitless, and irate residents threatened to cease paying their council rates. Media articles highlighted the issue. And that's the Corellas on roofs. I've got ahead of myself. As the state government person responsible for dealing with human-wildlife conflict, I received many complaints and drafted many responses to letters to the Minister for Conservation about the issue. I told a repeat complainant that if she organised a public meeting, I would ensure the local council was represented and I'd outline options for managing the problem. A public meeting was held with an independent facilitator, and 120 angry residents detailed their problems. I began by addressing some of their specific concerns, and then I described the ecology and behaviour, including play behaviour, of the Corellas, and was able to counter a lot of misconceptions about the birds. I listed the possible options and whether they were legal and effective, and indicated the government was there to provide technical advice but not to do the work, and recommended the formation of a working group of residents. Several of the attendees put their names down to participate in the group. The option available was to establish a scaring program to encourage the birds to roost elsewhere. Council undertook to do more frequent maintenance. Relations between council and residents improved after the public meeting, and complaints ceased. Meeting attendees had had their complaints heard and learned about Corellas and accepted responsibility for action if there was consensus to proceed. No further complaints were received. In conclusion, and there's more to it, but in conclusion, this process appears to be a good model for resolving challenging wildlife management situations where appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you.